I played, tested, studied, strategized, analyzed, and theorized 6v6 for 25 hours the last few weeks, utilizing 2 different versions of the 6v6 workshop code, playing both main tank, off tank, damage, and support, all while playing and spectating lobbies from Platinum to Grandmaster. Today I'm going to be sharing everything you need to know and prepare for with Overwatch's upcoming 6v6 experiment. For those who don't know me, my name is Spilo. I'm a professional Overwatch coach with over 10,000 hours of private coaching experience, all heroes, all roles. But more than that, I'm also someone who's coached in the esports scenes at both the Contenders and the Overwatch League level for 5 years. 3 of those coaching double shield, goats, dive comps, and every variation of 6v6 composition that's ever been meta. Point being, I know the game, I know its theory in both the 5v5 and 6v6 format from both the bronze level to the professional. One disclaimer I do need to get out of the way is that while the developers of the workshop codes I used did a phenomenal job putting it all together, in fact, I interviewed them, you can check that out here, it's not Blizzard endorsed officially. It's simply our best guess at how 6v6 may look in the future test. The good news is that while the details and hero viabilities may change between now and then, the theory that we're going to be talking about today will not. Before we talk about 6v6, let's talk briefly about why Overwatch went to 5v5 in the first place and why it's considering going back. First off was Sustain Watch. Overwatch had a series of really unfortunate metas, whether it was double shield and a lot of other metas that just basically revolved around not taking space, not taking angles, denying the fun of a lot of the more fun support and DPS hero categories, with the goal of just going towards moving into big clumps, denying off angles, sustain shields, more healing, and more healing. This was a big issue because a lot of hero design and balance issues were not addressed back in Overwatch 1. You see, say what you will about Overwatch 2, but the design and balance philosophy happens at a much more rapid rate. Back in Overwatch 1, we often had months and months with broken metas and no patch changes, and then finally when the patch did come through with some minor tiny little number tweak to healing, I mean, come on.
The Overwatch team has faced some criticism for being a little bit slow when it comes to our balance patches.
Are you serious?
This is also after the release of original Shield Orisa, Sigma, Baptiste, Brig, and Moira, all characters that contribute to the Sustain Watch group up, just tank it out, and just basically out-healing any sort of pressure. Notoriously a meta that was very unfriendly to a lot of the dive, more fun, and more popular characters like Reinhardt, Genji, Winston, Ana, and so on. Now, this was not necessarily a 6v6 issue. As we're going to talk about in a little bit here, there's a lot of ways in 6v6 could have functioned without this and done just fine. The problem was that a lot of the hero designs and balance done at that time was really, really bad. Regardless of whether this was a major factor in going to 5v5, I definitely think it was a minor factor because it was certainly a factor that moved us into role queue. Next up, individual impact through space, because this is something that when we're going into a first-person shooter that's going free to play, is people need to have a little bit, or need to feel like they have a little bit more individual playmaking. Now, whether 5v5 succeeded with that is up for debate, but one thing's for certain is that one player technically does have more impact on the battlefield in Overwatch 2 now. Finally, and maybe most importantly, were queue times. Now, I'm not going to go into details here. There's a great developer blog post on this, but basically queue times for tank were a big bottleneck, partly because tank is just not the most popular role in any game, period. And secondly, because tank was plagued with a lot of really crappy, unpopular hero designs. Sigma's done better since Overwatch 2, but Sigma in Overwatch 1, Orisa in Overwatch 1, and a lot of the other tanks that were meta in Overwatch 1, it just wasn't a very fun role to play. So not only were tank players not very common, but tank was plagued with a lot of heroes that people just didn't want to be forced to play. So the question is, after all that, why are we reconsidering 6v6? First off, let's talk about the philosophy about why 5v5 has had its issues. Number one is this solo tank problem, of where when you only have one person taking the attention, taking space, baiting attention, you can feel a little bit like a human punching bag. And with 2 tanks, yes, you were a lot squishier, but at least you had the opportunity to have somebody else split the attention with you. In addition to that, a lot of the design philosophy around solo tank has leaned more into the raid boss style of things, instead of having basically a slightly tankier DPS. And so what we have are these giga raid boss tanks that feel almost impossible to do anything to, and they can definitely introduce a lot of pain points into gameplay. I will say that it doesn't necessarily mean that tank is always the most impactful role. It often is, but Gavin Winter has elaborated that at least at the higher ranks, the convergence of which role contributes the most to winning a game is actually really close. And so that's good news from a balance perspective, but it doesn't necessarily make the game more fun to play. In addition to that, obviously with the announcement of solo tank, a lot of off tank players, people that used to play divas Zarya, and so on back in Overwatch 1 were rightfully concerned, and that's definitely been a big loss of the 5v5, is losing the off-tank identity of many of those characters and the tank synergy that so many people enjoy. In addition to that, the variety of tank combos is obviously just completely gone. One of the nice things about having 2 tanks is that introducing a new character into the hero pool is that you're going to have multiple different ways of comboing that character with all of the tanks. But when a new tank is introduced, you're just going to play it and nothing else. Can make the game feel a little bit more samey because instead of adding this new tank in combination with all the other tanks, it's just a new tank by itself. Finally, perhaps we have a little bit more confidence in our balance team to make aggressive changes as necessary for 6v6. You see, part of the reason why people have such a negative opinion of 6v6 is, that, as I said earlier, the design and balance of many of the characters at the time. Nowadays, while things can still be pretty ugly, at least there's quick adjustments and things they're willing to try and then dial back if it doesn't work. I don't think we would have had double shield with the current Overwatch 2 balance team for as long as we did. So how did we actually try 6v6? And this is where the workshop comes into play here. The workshop is a tool developed in Overwatch 1 that allows people to make up their own custom games and really to get quite complicated with it. What the workshop developers attempted to do is bring back Overwatch 1 for those who wanted to try it. It wasn't really a competition with the current developers of Overwatch 2, so much as an opportunity to go back and play the game the way that you remembered it. My adjustments that I made to this was to introduce the Season 9 projectile and health changes that I feel will not be reverted. You see, one of the limitations of the workshop code is that with the increase of projectile sizes in Season 9, they were not able to revert those. So while they had the original health pools of Overwatch 1, all the projectiles were easier, so it basically meant everyone was getting 2-shot. Didn't feel that was a very honest testing ground for what Overwatch 2 is likely to have in the future. So what I did is I had post-Season 9 health pools, post-Season 9 projectile sizes, and to give that as our testing environment for today. So overall, we're going to be looking at the good and the bad, noting that no matter the format, there will be upsides and downsides. So please draw your own conclusions from your own testing, and also reserve final judgment, of course, until you finally actually test the 6v6 thing, because this is just our best guess. Immediately upon testing, I noticed that Sustain Watch was a lot weaker. Orissa's rework, the mobility creep of some of the cast, the weaker position of some of the sustain/poke heroes like Baptiste, Brig, and Hanzo, especially in the code, made it feel nearly impossible to just turtle and sustain. And we tried. We tried the best variation of double shield. We tried running Bat Brig, and a lot of those combinations just didn't really work that well. On the code that we played, and what feels like the direction of Overwatch 2 in general, is that mobility and higher skill heroes felt a little bit more dominant. This was good because it shows that while the Overwatch 2 development team has had its hiccups, overall the game has moved a little bit away from the teeth-grindingly slow sustain aspects of Overwatch 1, even if you do bring back 6v6. And this means that one of the big arguments against 6v6 may not be near as much of a problem as people think. The bad news? Well, ignoring the queue times issue, which may be improved with making more appealing tank design, 2 specific problems stood out, and we're going to go into these in very thorough detail. Number 1, the space problem. Space is just generally more contested in 6v6 with or without double shields, often limiting solo capability to retake that space. Some of this is a stylistic choice, however. Number 2 is the hero problem. 6v6 did not seem to solve many of the tank hero design problems, even with some of the balancing efforts done by the 6v6 developers. We're going to elaborate deeply on both of these points because both are extremely important to fixing 6v6 in the future. First off, let's talk about the space problem. Many of the 6v6 fears comes from bad memories of being held hostage in a 2CP choke with double shield. The good news is that while space was an issue, it was less of an issue than I expected, partly due to the reduction of Sustain Watch, what we talked about earlier, but it's also because map design in Overwatch 2 has evolved for the better. That being said, even without as bad chokes, there's still a clear increase in defender's advantage in 6v6, as a tank setup plus proximity, being able to close the distance, is still a major factor in controlling space. Let me demonstrate. So if we look here, Havana first defense here. Essentially, you have 2 tanks split on either side of the choke. In Overwatch 2, with 5v5, there's more space for the enemy team to rotate around right side to attack the high ground, and it's a little bit harder for the enemy team to control that space. If there's anybody going to be controlling that space, it's going to be a DPS or support, which is a little bit easier to clear out at that proximity. However, if you replace that DPS with a tank, that tank it's very difficult to clear out because to get a sight line to poke that tank out, you risk running into the enemy tank or the enemy DPS. And to close the distance to quote-unquote brawl that tank out, well, that's just a lot harder to do to a tank than it is to a DPS or support. Anytime there's any sort of choke where a tank can basically play around a corner, contest space, close the sight lines, it can feel a little bit harder to retake space in 6v6. And I found this to be the case on a lot of maps, King's Row, Flashpoint, and so on. Although interestingly enough, on Flashpoint, just because of how broad the maps were, 6v6 felt a lot less congested. You see, the problem here is that a lot of people like to push out this narrative, which is definitely true to extent, that in 6v6 it's easier to poke out the tank because you have less HP. But the problem with that is that's not always possible with Defender's advantage. You see, tanks in Overwatch 2 largely as a whole are all stronger up close. Now, they're not necessarily stronger up close to each other, but they're definitely stronger up close to squishies. For example, Sigma is largely seen as a poke tank, but if you get up close to Sigma as a squishy, that's a really, really bad matchup for 99% of the cast. And so the problem with that is that anytime that you have any corners, choke points, where there are multiple lines of attack, it can be very easy as defending tanks in 6v6 to choke out all those sight lines and force you to close the distance onto the tank to create space. It's not so easy to just simply take an angle and poke out the tank and a lot of these choke points. And while if you do get the opportunity to do that, it's very effective. If you don't, you're really relying off of your tank to take the space for you. The importance of mobility and range to open up different angles cannot be understated. Many of the times where I felt choked out, it's because that I was playing a DPS character or a support character that didn't have the mobility to choose all the angles that I wanted to. And that definitely left some DPS, some supports feeling really good in the tank trades and some feeling really bad. Elaborating on this is partly why hit scan was such a hit or miss, no pun intended, in this exact same game mode. When I had Defender's Advantage as a hit scan, or when we had Defender's Advantage as a hit scan, it felt very oppressive because to get to the hit scan, you had to kind of crank through two angles that tanks were holding in close range. But attacking as a hit scan when you didn't have space could feel very miserable because closing the distance with most hit scan characters just isn't really a good option, even if the tanks are a little bit squishier. So finding angles and sightlines felt a lot more difficult. I found the binary impact of hit scan sometimes oppressive in defense, sometimes underwhelming on attack, to be a very difficult problem to solve with 6v6, especially with characters like Widowmaker, who went from being completely worthless in some situations in our testing to being absolutely untouchable. You are very reliant on your tanks to create space. So this is again where the 6v6 versus 5v5 preference is: do you prefer the more team coordination of taking space with your tanks, or do you prefer the individual opportunity or the individual impact of 5v5? It's why Overwatch 2 feels more deathmatchy. Not that there's necessarily less strategy, there's just more space, so there's more individual opportunity to take and hold space appropriately. It's more democratic, and there's no real guaranteed safety really in any position that you're holding because there's always another angle the enemy team could take. In addition to that, I want to point out there's also a serious hero design discrepancy at taking different types of space. You see, a lot of the ugly stepchildren of hero design, like Malga, Roadhog, really struggle taking space when they could just constantly get poked out. You're very reliant on your tank trade to take space, so if you don't necessarily have the right tank combo to break the choke, then you might have a bad time, even though those chokes are better. The big difference is there's more individual autonomy in 5v5, but also one bad apple can ruin the bunch a lot easier. Do you find the tank trade / complexity of using CDs on the enemy tanks with your tanks to scratch your competitive itch? Tank players especially like this, and for good reason. It's a lot of fun. Or do you like the complexity, responsibility of reading the situation and the space available to you as a DPS or support player? Overwatch 2 has more options in that category. On the flip side, Overwatch 1 has objectively more immediate complexity on the tank trades, where Overwatch 2 has objectively more immediate complexity in positioning and controlling space. As often by the time we're conceding the control of the space outside the tank trade, the fight may already be decided. For example, if I were to take a Route 66 attack with double bubble Winston Zarya trade, my Winston Zarya might need to try to look for a favorable angle on the enemy tank, try to set up a DPS angle at the same time, and then off of that trade, look for the opportunity to stage for backline as a final result. Whereas in 5v5, you can more immediately set up your DPS on the high ground, the left side, the low ground on the right side, and look for a trade off of your Winston dive. This makes things a little bit more creative for your DPS, but definitely limits your tank options. So how does this affect DPS players? Well, there's more targets to shoot, but the choices and practice are generally not always super available. You can put a lot more pressure as a DPS character onto tanks now than you were before, but you might not always have the positions that you'd like to actually shoot what you'd like to shoot. So there's more options if you can get the space, but you probably won't always get that exact same space. However, for certain characters that have more mobility, I found this to be a little bit less of an issue. We'll talk more about that later. Supports, there's just more responsibility to heal. There's now 2 tanks to heal, even if their health pools are a little bit smaller, so you're going to be doing more of that. And also there's a little bit worse individual matchup versus poking a tank. Now, that definitely got better in 6v6, but unfortunately, a lot of support characters just don't do great versus tanks in damage, with the exception of maybe like Zen or Bap. So even though tanks are a little bit squishy, that's not really going to change how you position all that much compared to damage characters that just generally burn tanks better. This means that support with positioning is generally impacted a lot more in terms of not being able to take proactive angles near as much. You remember early Overwatch 2 where every support player was crying that they were dying off of cooldown? Well, that was part of the adjustment required for support players to be a lot more proactive and a lot more duel-oriented. Going back to 6v6 would be dialing this back, going the opposite direction. Not a bad thing, but again, personal preference. I found support skill expression to be diminished slightly, tank to increase slightly, and DPS feels about the same, just different. Finally, some heroes are going to leave you feeling gatekept in terms of taking space, just like it did back in Overwatch 1. Off of that, let's segue into hero design problems. Let's talk about the good first. Some heroes felt pretty darn good from our testing. Doomfist, Junker Queen, and individual hero tweaks like Ryanp Pin Cancel all function really nicely in the new environment. Oh, and both enabler tanks, Zarya and D.Va, felt great again, as their original identity has been restored. The bad, well, Mauga had his moments, but felt demanding of the right tank combo to function. Turns out self-heal on the enemy tank isn't such a great design. Ramatra felt sluggish and survival-focused, and his long but overly impactful CD cycle left him with massive windows of vulnerability, like a Winston bubble but without the mobility of Monkey. Orisa lacks all identity besides focus tank in Overwatch 2, and so therefore that carries over to Overwatch 1, but that's now much worse as she benefits less from other tanks supporting her, and she doesn't really support the other tanks either. And then Roadhog, well, he's just awful in every single way. Turns out that while some heroes definitely feel better in the 6v6 format, notably off tanks, some heroes don't. Turns out a bad apple is still a bad apple, and a different, even better format doesn't change that. My experience with playing versus some of the bad apples mentioned before was a funny balance of being amused at how inconsistent and awkward they were compared to the voluptuous tank combos of Winston, Ryan, Zarya, Doomfist, D.Va, Ball, and Junker Queen, and how annoyed it made me when we had one of those heroes in my team, especially when we didn't have space. You see, that's probably the biggest consistent theme between Roadhog, Orisa, Mauga, and to an extent Ramatra. They all either have glaring weaknesses in their defensive capabilities, usually reliance on sustain or just survival, are tank buster focused, something that's a lot more awkward in the double tank format, or severely lacking consistent mobility or range. Pre-rework Orisa Roadhog were horrible to play versus in Overwatch 1, but they function a little bit better due to one reason. They had ways to contribute outside of the tank trade, with also more team utility to contribute as well. Orisa's shield, hull, range pressure, and bongo were all phenomenal tools to pressure and create space from range. Not in a good way for balance necessarily, but in an impactful way. And for Roadhog, ironically, the rework made him worse, because he lost nearly all neutral pressure with the rework to his weapon and his alternate fire. It's either close range take pressure, hook, and that's about it. You can flank, but if the map doesn't provide those options, or you get poked out, you're cooked. Even newer kids in the block like Ramatra and Mauga were a bit awkward. Mao was very reliant off of Zarya or another dive tank to enable a lot of his all-in slam cardiac cycles, while being denied by two forms of tank mitigation to get his self-heal rolling. And Ramatra's CDs are so long and his Omnic form poke so bad at range, they often ended up in just take aggro because bullying the solo tank doesn't work so well anymore. Tanks that demand support without providing consistent utility in return. They don't do well. Maybe there's a synergy in here that could make these heroes work, but we weren't able to solve them with the short period of time that we tried. The point remains, whether weak, dull, or frustrating to play with or against, these heroes are still flops in my eyes on the hero cast, and whether 5v5 or 6v6, much work is needed to match the creativity, complexity, and dynamics of the other tanks in the cast. Now we're gonna get into some feedback here. The last day of Pugs that we did, we spent around 4 or 5 hours playing with only high elo players, Masters, GM, and so on, and we wanted to try to create a more environment where people were more communicating, trying to play optimal tank strategies, and just trying different things. I got some feedback from all of these players that I want to share with you guys here, which will echo some of my points before, and also provide a different perspective. Number one, let's talk about tanks. Tank felt more limited, but didn't necessarily feel worse. Another player says tank combos heavily affected their enjoyment. Very, very high highs, very low lows depending on their partner. In addition to that, the good news though is that when the combo worked, the attention split from the other tank was definitely noticeable when coordinated or had the right combo. And this is great. In the 5v5 environment, one of the big problems is that all the attention is being put on you. Well, this player says if you get the right tank combo and you communicate and you synchronize well, it's really nice to not feel like everybody's focusing you down all the time. That's great feedback to hear. Now for the DPS players, some of them said that Genji Tracer felt very good. Some of the more mobility options, because you could set up a little bit easier than some of the hit scan characters, felt great. Flexible positioning, and you could actually have decent impact on tank trades. They said that poke heroes felt tough, and it felt sometimes hard to take angles with some DPS. It could be even hard to get support on these angles because your supports were generally more tied up supporting the tank trade. Chokes didn't feel quite as bad as expected was the general take. For support players, building certain support ults a lot faster was interesting, but you did have to play a little bit more conservative. We'll talk more about that one later. They said there was a lot less room for solo play, and there was a lot more healing, but it was still fun to play. One of the questions brought up by one of the support players has said, is there less room for OTPs because there's less playstyle flexibility in 6v6? Now you might, before you say, oh, playstyle, you can poke tank, you can poke DPS support, we're talking specifically about positioning, because one of the challenges of having more congested chokes is that more of those chokes congested means there's fewer positioning options for an unorthodox people. Depending on the choke, you might need a certain couple of different DPS characters or support characters to break that choke. If you pick the wrong one, you may not have the space that you need to function with that character in that situation. Something worth considering. Now let's share my study notes. So I spent the last day studying from overheads over many of the high elo games that we talked about, and not just playing the game, but actually strategizing and taking notes on exactly what could have been done, what felt good, what felt bad. Couple notes here. Number one, staggering was a bit worse in 66 because there's just more people to mess it up. It's interesting to see how this changes with the wave spawns that they're currently testing in Overwatch right now. Number two, distance is key for living tank combos / dives as a support or DPS. Proximity is very, very risky because in Overwatch 2 and 5v5, generally you can take a closer angle as long as it's away from the tank. In 6v6, there's now twice as many tanks, even though they're a little bit squishier, so you actually need to create a little bit of distance between yourself and the enemy tank, and do so consistently because there really isn't any good close angle. I found myself dying a lot more often as a support or DPS, when not necessarily when I was just taking angles in the enemy tank, that's dumb, but a bubbled Winston, a bubbled Zarya, a matrixed Winston, a bubbled Ryan, even something like a double dive tank where diving on top of me, that was a lot harder to avoid through taking angles. You just had to do more stuff, more work through distance management. This reminds me a lot of my old Overwatch 1 coaching, which a lot of time if you're playing support DPS was about kind of playing a long distance, playing a corner, trying to keep a long distance between yourself and the enemy tank dive or tank combo that was inevitably coming in. Something to point out. However, after those tanks do commit those cooldowns, they are a lot more vulnerable than they are in Overwatch 2. Moving on from here, tanks must clear and hold space on angles. It is your responsibility to create clear space, not just to group up and choke, but also to contest other chokes. DPS and supports cannot consistently do it on their own in most spots, especially if there's an enemy tank there. Angles still matter in 6v6 just as much as they did in 5v5, but you're a lot more reliant on your tanks to actually control those chokes and angles than you were in Overwatch 2, where there's a little bit more individual autonomy. There's some interesting dynamics that kind of revolve around this, where is it better to support my tank on main or defend clear an angle that's wide open? It becomes more of a priority to support maybe the tanks on main because there's now two of them that you have to support as a healer, but it's a much more of a resource commitment requirement, and then you might leave yourself vulnerable to an angle. It's a tricky balance. Finally, the last thing here, and this is really important, is when you don't have space in 66, hero pick matters a lot more. We talked about this earlier. There's going to be a lot of chokes, a lot of positions. Maybe they don't have verticality, maybe they do have verticality, maybe they have flanks, maybe they don't have flanks, maybe it's close, maybe it's long. You need to pick the right DPS or the support for the situation, because taking space with every DPS and with every support character is just not as possible in the 66 format. It's a funny callback to the rock, paper, scissors problems that 5v5 has. 5v5 has the tank rock, paper, scissors, where counterpicking the enemy tank, especially as the tank, can feel more valuable than it has a right to be. And 66, counterpicking the space, counterpicking the map is actually very, very important. Final thoughts here. I'm going to ride the fence with this one because I frankly haven't played the official attempt at 66 and nobody has. But I will say this, I did have a lot of fun, and there's a lot of potential for this game mode, especially with appropriate adjustments to hero design and considerations for some of 66 downsides. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, but first, seriously, I encourage you to test these things first, not only to give you a better perspective on exactly the feedback of things, but also because it's just a lot of fun. I'll drop my code in the comments, which is the one that's post Season 9, but you can also have your own matchmaker one that's pre-Season 9, and you don't even need to do anything. Just join the Discord and you're ready to roll. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Let's see what happens in the future.